Our next speaker will be Dr. Marsh, a physicist retired from Argonne National Laboratory, who has worked and published widely in the areas of science, nuclear power, and foreign affairs. He was a consultant to the Department of Defense on strategic nuclear technology and policy in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and served with the U.S. START delegation in Geneva. And he's a fellow of the American Physical Society. He's going to tell us how nuclear power contributes to global warming, right? No, it's not quite. Thank you very much. Our next speaker.
Thank you very much. Well, with that little bio, you must wonder what I'm doing here talking about climate. And it all started really back in the 1960s when we were sliding into an ice age, if anybody remembers that prehistoric period. And during that period, I got interested in this subject and continued my interest until till the present. At one time in the recent past, I did have the opportunity to manage a very large Air Force program on weather forecasting, and the job there was to take a community model from the National Center for Atmospheric Research and move it over to a parallel computer. Because at that time, basically, you could get a 24-hour forecast in 24 hours. So this was an interesting program, and it gave me an opportunity to also learn about how the models are constructed, there being very little difference between weather and climate models, and also about data assimilation and so forth. So in thinking about what I would talk about today, I thought about giving a scientific presentation, but decided on something else. And that something else is perhaps a little closer to the original sign out there, which said economics as opposed to science. And I hope you'll find it somewhat interesting. In any case, my papers on global warming and climate science are available both on the preprint archive, that's arxiv.org, and also on my website, which is gemarsh.com. And if you go to that, be sure to click on global warming, you'll get a lot of other things. So I thought I would address instead the question of how it is that perfectly intelligent people, even those with a relevant background, could support the idea of a climate Armageddon. And what I would like to do in this talk is really convince you that the issue of climate change is not simply one of proving who is right or wrong, and not just about the IPCC and its sort of alarmist reports, but to understand the position taken by many individuals and governments, one really needs to look at the issue in a much broader context. Let me start with what we agree upon. Most of us agree that the greater part of carbon dioxide was put into the atmosphere by human activities. Something like about 80% was done after 1940, and that the temperature increased slightly from 1950 till about 1970, despite the fact that carbon dioxide was going up, as was mentioned before. And since then, the temperature rose until what happened here? I think I'm pressing on the button. Well, should I close this?
I think so. Go ahead.
Yeah, it might be a good idea to do that, because otherwise you're going to get some very strange things going on here. In any case, since 1998, the rise in temperature, as was just explained, has stalled. While we might believe, to use the IPCC phrase, that this temperature history is likely, we would be hard-pressed to prove it by the quality of data that is available out there. Not only is there no consistent temperature data over the last century or so, there is also a real question as to whether there even exists a physically meaningful concept of the Earth's global temperature in the context of global warming. The Earth is not in thermodynamic equilibrium, and an average of temperature data sampled at different parts in a non-equilibrium system cannot be said to be the temperature of the whole. Nonetheless, I, like everybody else, will continue to use this concept for lack of anything better. To compound the uncertainty, it was already well known in 1996 that almost all of the cooling in the Northwest Atlantic and the warming across Europe and Eurasia since the mid-1970s resulted from changes in the North Atlantic Oscillation, not carbon dioxide. But in terms of current and future policy decisions, perhaps the most important uncertainty is that which is inherent in the models used by the IPCC. The intermodal variability of future climate predictions can exceed 10 degrees centigrade at high latitudes. Moreover, the predicted predicted change in both mid and high latitudes is less than the modeling errors. This does not give one a great deal of confidence. There is no disagreement that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, albeit a minor one. But there is disagreement over the value of the parameter used to determine forcing at the tropopause due to an increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. Many believe the value used by the IPCC is too large, and if this is the case, there is no reason to think that the small warming since the mid-1970s is of anthropogenic origin. This is reinforced by the fact that we really do not understand interglacial climates. Maximum interglacial temperatures in Antarctica over the past 340,000 years are now believed to have been some 6 to 10 degrees centigrade above present values. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations during past interglacials were comparable to today, and in any case could not possibly have been responsible for the difference, since the concentrations needed would have been far too high. All this tells us two things. First, that much, if not all, of the warming during the last 20th century was most likely a result of natural rather than anthropogenic causes. And second, model projections are not a sound basis for public policy. What then is driving the global warming juggernaut? There are many reasons one might point to that motivate environmentalists, other special interests, and the population as a whole. But none provide a satisfactory answer for the complicity of governments. The U.S. government in particular has many people who are aware of the uncertainties involved in climate science and its predictive powers. If the U.S. government were primarily concerned with carbon dioxide emissions, it would not be pursuing technologies like solar and wind. They are fully aware of the prediction by the International Energy Agency that says that all alternative sources of energy will contribute no more than 2% to the world's energy supply by 2030 or 2040. They also know that over 40% of the U.S. emissions of carbon dioxide come from the burning of fossil fuels for electricity generation. Rationally, if one would formulate a policy to eliminate the largest single source of carbon dioxide emissions before going after the smaller sources. If the government were serious about lowering carbon dioxide emissions, they would create significant incentives to replace power plants that burn fossil fuels with nuclear. After all, nuclear plants emit no carbon dioxide, and the technology is mature. Moreover, they do not emit the real pollutants that cause tens of thousands of premature deaths each year. Electricity from nuclear plants in the U.S. France, after all, has gotten its electricity from nuclear power for many decades at this point. And the principal impediment to doing that in the United States is the irrational regulatory process that greatly increases costs. The so-called waste problem is a political problem, not a technical one. The waste can be burned in fast-spectrum reactors, also a mature technology, thereby using about 99% of the energy in the original uranium, rather than the roughly 5% gotten today. Following this path means that nuclear power would become an inexhaustible source of electricity. The radioactivity of the less than 1% of real waste, which is composed of fission products, would fall below that of the original ore in less than 500 years. Yucca Mountain could accommodate the quantity of real waste for the indefinite future. So if carbon dioxide emissions are not the real concern, what is? The answer lies in the national security area, and in particular with the necessity for guaranteeing the supply of cheap oil. The use of oil is widespread in industry and will be irreplaceable in the transportation sector for decades. In 2007, the IEA predicted that the oil fields that the US and Europe depend upon will peak in the next 5 to 7 years. And this includes those of Russia, the US, Mexico, and Norway. It is also estimated that the world energy demand will increase by 50% by 2030. To meet this demand, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, where most of the world's remaining readily accessible oil is found, will have to almost double its production. Most of that increase will have to come from Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. Saudi Arabia alone is expected to account for a third, and that is at the root of the problem. There is plenty of oil, perhaps as much as the 7,200 billion barrels estimated by ExxonMobil. But international economic realities, not under the control of any one government, mandate that cheaper oil will be used before investments are made to bring more expensive reserves to market. Nor can alternative sources of oil begin production immediately if they are needed. There is a ramp-up period of years. And if the phasing in of such reserves doesn't match the decline of current oil fields, rising prices and conflict over resources are inevitable. In thinking about oil, it would also help if the real price of oil were used rather than the subsidized one. The real price includes the vast sums poured into the Gulf region, both directly and in the form of military deployments needed to guarantee the free flow of oil from this unstable and politically difficult region. The necessity of maintaining this supply is not only extremely costly, it also puts enormous constraints on the diplomacy of not only the US, but also Europe and Japan. When one talks about national security interests of these and many other countries in the Gulf area, one is talking about oil. Because it does not take a great deal of oil to impact prices on the margin, introducing hybrids and other efficiency measures can buy some time by decreasing demand. Increasing the supply of domestic oil would also help, and this is undoubtedly the reason for the recent Obama administration's proposal to open large expanses along the Atlantic coastline, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and the north coast of Alaska to oil and natural gas drilling. Opening up these areas would extend the lifetime of U.S. reserves of conventional oil, and that could affect the price on the margin, buying some additional time. Pursuing climate change legislation is designed to curb carbon emissions is probably a political trade-off, one that the administration believes would also increase efficiency. Unfortunately, the recent drilling problems in the Gulf of Mexico probably preclude opening up additional offshore areas to drilling for some time. Energy policy in the United States has been an oxymoron for quite some time, and its lack has had a serious impact on international and economic relations. We, as well as much of the rest of the world, are literally being held over the barrel. During the last decade or so, this situation has become an increasingly difficult problem. But even so, one might ask if it justifies misleading the public by exaggerating the threat of possible global warming. I say exaggerating because at our current level of understanding, if there has been warming, it would seem to be well within natural variations since the last ice age. Of course, the question is unfair. There has never been an explicit policy decision to mislead the public on this issue, and certainly not by any recent U.S. administrations. The problem is a very deep one that has to do with the way science is presented to the increasingly poorly educated public, particularly by the media. Al Gore's exceptionally well-done film, An Inconvenient Truth, with all of its factual deficiencies, has had an enormous impact throughout the world, and especially on those with environmental concerns and, many others. And while the film induces fear in the viewer, and this is fundamental to its effectiveness, in the end it gives the public a positive message. one of hope by convincing them that they are in control of their future. The only other example of a film that comes to mind that had such a wide effect on public perceptions is Jane Fonda's film, The China Syndrome. But she, unlike Gore, failed to get the message across. The film was intended to trash large corporations and their amoral behavior, not nuclear power, although the nuclear issue was used as a scare tactic. The key point is that these films were intended to raise public opposition and give the positive message that the future is in the hands of the body politic. Telling the public that the claims by the IPCC and its supporters are wrong may be correct and necessary, but it is also ineffective unless coupled with a positive message and a vision for the future. After all, the public as a whole does not have the background or confidence needed to decide which side of the debate is correct. What would be more effective is to continue the process of informing the public about the large uncertainties in climate science, but also to offer insurance in the form of an energy policy that would substantially reduce carbon dioxide emissions by phasing in nuclear power for electricity generation. This would allay public fears of a climate catastrophe and have the added benefit of eliminating the real pollution emitted by burning coal. The public must also come to realize that despite the hype, not only would wind turbines and solar cells be unable to substitute for fossil fuels in producing baseload electricity, they do not even address the problems of the transportation sector. In time, fuels produced by biologically engineered organisms, as opposed to crop-based fuels that compete with food production, may be able to produce significant amounts of liquid fuels, but that remains to be shown. So while many in the general public may believe there is a danger from global warming due to alarmist IPCC reports and the media's presentation of the issue, others buy into the idea of a global warming crisis for reasons having little to do with fear of climate catastrophe. I have often heard the comment that whatever the truth may be, the world is being driven in the right direction. We must increase efficiency and reduce dependence on oil imports. Those who believe carbon dioxide is responsible for whatever recent warming has occurred see climate policy and energy policy as inextricably linked. And since getting a coherent energy policy in much of the world is unachievable, climate policy is used to drive energy policy. Thank you very much.